Peter Singer is one of the most prominent representatives of contemporary utilitarianism and applied ethics. He developed a modern version of utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism. In his main work, Practical Ethics, he outlines his ethical approach, develops a new concept of the person, and draws conclusions for many problem areas of applied ethics. His views on abortion and euthanasia led to heated discussions, particularly in Germany. Events at which he appeared were sometimes massively disrupted. Singer himself was attacked. Some call him a philanthropist, others the most dangerous man in the world. Let's take a look at why. Peter Singer was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1946. He is a famous contemporary philosopher, animal rights activist, and co-founder of the social movement of effective altruism. He is involved nationally and internationally in various organizations such as the Australian Green Party, Oxfam, Animal Rights International, and the charity he founded, The Life You Can Save. His parents were Jewish and emigrated from Vienna to Australia in 1938. He lost 3 of his grandparents in the Holocaust. Singer has taught at various universities, including Oxford, New York, Melbourne, and Princeton. His book, Animal Liberation, was published in 1975. In it, he laid the foundations for the worldwide animal liberation movement. The revised and updated edition, Animal Liberation Now, was published in 2023. Singer's main work, Practical Ethics, was first published in 1979 and has since been revised twice and new chapters added. In the book, Peter Singer develops his preference utilitarian approach and applies it to various areas of applied practical ethics. In the book, he addresses the treatment of animals, the status of human life, and our obligation towards the poor and our environment. Although Singer today describes himself as a hedonistic utilitarian, it is worth taking a closer look at the moral philosophical position of preference utilitarianism that he developed. In contrast to classical utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism is no longer concerned with maximizing pleasure and minimizing displeasure, but with the maximum fulfillment of interests or preferences. Preferences are any wishes or interests that relate to objects, actions, or conditions in the future. This includes all rational and emotional interests of a being, including the basic rational interest in life. It is therefore not only about the current and context-dependent interest at the time of the action, but, at least in the case of persons, also about future-oriented interests. The preferences of all affected beings must be taken into account in order to assess an action and its effects. Different beings are capable of different preferences. If an action fulfills as many preferences of all those affected as possible, this action is morally good. Otherwise, a balance must be found, for example, by fulfilling the previously disregarded preferences to a greater extent through another act. The aim of every action must therefore be to satisfy as many preferences of all those involved as possible. Where this is not possible, the unsatisfied preferences must be compensated for. But how exactly should the interests or preferences of the entities involved be weighed up against each other? According to Singer, ethics takes a universal standpoint. Where moral judgments are made, one must therefore go beyond one's own point of view. The moral standpoint should correspond to that of the impartial or ideal observer. The principle of equal consideration of interest applies here. This means that the interest of all persons must have equal weight. For whatever reason, no one person counts more than the other. Nationality, sex, appearance, social status, and so on must not play a role. The interests are weighed up impartially against each other. Judgments are therefore made from a universalistic point of view. My own interests or preferences do not count more than the interests of others. The principle of equal consideration of interests corresponds to the universalist principle of classical utilitarianism. However, this principle does not mean that an individual moral judgment must be universally applicable. It is decided on a case-by-case basis, depending on the situation. According to Singer, the interests or preferences differ fundamentally depending on the class of being in question. The classification of beings and the resulting consequences for applied ethics are the reason for the vehement criticism of Singer's ethics. Singer distinguishes 3 classes of beings whose interests or preferences must be taken into account in different ways. The first class includes non-sentient beings. that is, beings without consciousness, for example, inanimate objects, plants, animals without a central nervous system, and fetuses. They have no developed central nervous system and can therefore feel no pleasure and no pain. Since they have no conscious experiences, they cannot feel pleasure or pain. They have no value in themselves. We have no obligation towards them. The second class includes conscious sentient beings, for example, animals with a central nervous system, newborns, severely disabled people. Since they can feel pleasure and pain, they have a value in themselves. We should treat them in a classic utilitarian way, that is, create the greatest possible happiness for the greatest possible number. Their interests must be taken into account. However, since these beings are not self-conscious, they do not know themselves as distinct entities with a past and a future. They are individually interchangeable or replaceable. Since conscious, sentient beings have no temporal consciousness, their preferences are not future-oriented and therefore do not require life, the continuation of their existence, to fulfill future preferences. They may be killed painlessly if this satisfies most of the interests of all those affected. The class of persons includes humans who are self-conscious, but also chimpanzees, gorillas, whales, and dolphins. They are aware of themselves as distinct entities with a past and a future. They see themselves as existing over time and separate from their environment. Their interests are therefore more long-term and far more complex than those of merely conscious sentient beings. The following criteria must be met for an entity to be considered a person. It must be aware of itself, that is, have an awareness of its identity over time. A person is aware that they were the same person in the past and will be the same person in the future. A person is also, just like conscious sentient beings, sentient, that is capable of feeling pleasure and pain. And it is autonomous, independent of others. According to Singer, we must treat persons in a preference utilitarian way. We must act in such a way that we consider and take into account the preferences, the interests, wishes, and future plans of all those affected by our actions in the same way. In contrast to merely conscious sentient beings, there is no individual substitutability for persons. They have an individual right to life, because the preferences of most persons include the continuation of their own existence in the future, or is necessary for the realization of preferences. A person's preferences are future-oriented due to their self-consciousness. Disregarding a person's preferences, therefore, carries more weight than is the case with other beings. This is particularly true with regard to killing. In the case of persons, this can never be compensated. We can already see that Singer's concept of the person differs greatly from the traditional, above all Christian, view of the human being. Singer has since reconsidered and changed some of his earlier views. He is currently also reconsidering, from his current classical utilitarian standpoint, his view that the injustice of killing depends essentially on the ability of those killed to see themselves as existing over time. More on this later. Human life is not sacred. Peter Singer introduces his book Life and Death with this thesis. Two consequences result from this thesis. Firstly, the demand for equal consideration of the interests of animals, that is, a strong revaluation of animals, and secondly, the rejection of the concept of human dignity. According to Singer, only those with rationality and self-consciousness have a right to life. This means that there is no absolute right to life for humans. People only have an unconditional right to life if they currently have person status, that is, autonomy and self-consciousness, and therefore the ability to make preferences. Singer does not assign his three types of being to certain species in a speciesist way, but argues actualistically. Thus, a being is only a person if it is currently capable of performing the characteristics of personhood. This means that human embryos, newborns, severely disabled people, dementia patients, and comatose people are not persons and therefore have no individual right to life. According to Singer, a great ape is higher than a severely disabled human. In his opinion, the alleged higher status of humans and the gap between humans and animals goes back to outdated religious traditions. It is about comparing individuals with each other, and it is about cognitive abilities, regardless of the species. Peter Singer considers the interests or preferences of those affected by an action across genus or species boundaries. Interest is interest, whosever interest it may be. Speciesism means the arbitrary preference of conspecifics, in our case, humans. In Singer's view, such preferential treatment or discrimination according to species is to be rejected in a similar way to racism or sexism. In contrast to classical utilitarianism, in Singer's preference utilitarianism, no person who prefers to continue living may be killed. This is because persons have the capacity for preferences that can no longer be acted out when they are dead. In contrast to classical utilitarianism, tyrannicide and the death penalty are therefore prohibited. Singer's classification of beings has important consequences for animal and medical ethics in particular. Let's first take a look at animal ethics. Fur farms, industrial factory farming, transportation of livestock for slaughter throughout Europe, animal testing, and much more are not legitimate, as the interests of the animals are not sufficiently taken into account. The immeasurable suffering of animals is disproportionate to the benefits for humans. According to Singer, great apes are persons and must therefore be given the same moral consideration as humans. Their preferences must be taken into account, and they have an individual right to life. Animal experiments on apes and keeping them in zoos are therefore not morally legitimate. Peter Singer is co-founder of the Great Ape Project. The project aims to grant certain human rights, such as the right to life, the right to individual freedom and protection from torture, to the great apes. Appropriate laws are intended to put a stop to zoo and circus keeping, the hunt for so-called bushmeat and animal experiments. Now to medical ethics. The killing of non-persons who only have unspecific interests but no preferences is legitimate. Severely disabled infants, dementia patients, and comatose people may therefore be killed. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, cloning of human stem cells, and similar practices involving Class 1 beings, that is, beings without consciousness and therefore without any interests, are also legitimate. Peter Singer breaks with the tradition of the inviolability or sanctity of human life. In his view, not everyone has a right to life. The destruction of a human life is not always an injustice and is sometimes even morally required. His declassification of people as non-persons is criticized as inhumane, especially by associations for the disabled. Disabled people's associations do not want a new euthanasia debate, as was the case during the Nazi era. Singer's concept of the person, which denies severely disabled people the status of a person, reminds them of the Nazi ideology of unworthy life. They accuse Singer and other bioethicists of denying the right to life to people who do not meet society's performance standards. They fear that old euthanasia ideas are being made acceptable again under the guise of a seemingly unprejudiced discussion. A further criticism is directed against Singer's actualistic concept of the person. Anyone who does not currently fulfill the status of being a person, such as newborns or comatose people, also has no unconditional right to life in Singer's view and may be killed. However, such beings do have the potential to develop into persons with an individual right to life. Peter Singer has since changed some of his earlier views and currently favors hedonistic utilitarianism rather than preference utilitarianism. He writes, "My views are not fixed. Many good philosophers disagree with me, and all philosophers should be open to changing their views on the basis of new arguments and objections. I am currently reconsidering some of the answers given above, especially those in which I regard the wrongness of killing as significantly affected by the capacity of those killed to see themselves as existing over time. This is a view that derived from my earlier acceptance of preference utilitarianism, but it does not fit well with hedonistic utilitarianism, which I am now more inclined to favor." For example, in the revised 2013 edition of Practical Ethics, he now considers tyrannicide to be justified in certain circumstances. He also makes a qualification regarding the killing of elderly people with dementia, or people who have been injured in accidents, that is, who used to have a sense of the future but have now lost it. He writes, "When a human being once had a sense of the future but has now lost it, we should be guided by what he or she would have wanted to happen in these circumstances. So if someone would not have wanted to be kept alive after losing their awareness of their future, we may be justified in ending their life. But if they would not have wanted to be killed under these circumstances, that is an important reason why we should not do so." Singer advocates taking into account the interests of all those affected by an action across national and even species boundaries. This makes him a committed campaigner for more global justice, environmental protection, and animal rights. His argument is consistent if one is prepared to break with the traditional ethics of the sanctity of human life. However, the numerous protests against Singer's presence at discussion panels and symposia show that not everyone is prepared to do so. What is your opinion? Do all humans have an unconditional right to life, or only those who correspond to Singer's concept of personhood? And should the interests of animals, especially personal animals such as apes and dolphins, be given greater consideration? Feel free to write your opinion in the comments below.